Sa galakak ang nakakikok.
I am not sleeping. I am alive.
For Alaska Natives, honoring tradition helps to preserve our culture, our communities, and our health. The way we collect and prepare food is a time-honored process, passed down from one generation to the next. This knowledge is expressed everywhere, in dance, in stories, and in many aspects of our daily lives. Through a traditional lifestyle, we honor our culture and carry on a way of life vital to our identity as Alaska Natives. It defined the lives of our ancestors and still shapes our lives today. But in some ways, our lives are very different from that of our ancestors. The environment has changed, and so has our lives and our villages, but we continue to depend on traditional lifestyles to keep us well. More and more, our foods come from the store. We know that some of it is healthy, and we know some of it is not. But our traditional diet is healthy. It provides good nutrition, exercise, and an opportunity to spend time with friends. It tastes good, and it also makes us feel good. And yet we worry about contaminants in our food. They are in the store-bought foods, and they are in our traditional foods as well. In this film, we will try to answer 3 important questions. Where do contaminants come from? How do they get into our bodies? And how can we monitor for contaminants in our bodies and in our foods? Dr. James Berner is a pediatrician and internist at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium in Anchorage, Alaska. He has been Director of Community Health Services since 1984. With funding from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Centers for Disease Control, he is looking at the levels of contaminants in pregnant mothers and newborn infants across Alaska. Dr. Berner addresses the question of where contaminants come from and how they get into our bodies.
One of the big concerns for Alaska's native population, and all Alaskans really, are the presence of new industrial and agricultural chemicals that are finding their way into the subsistence foods that all Alaskans enjoy and that Alaska Natives depend on. We call these contaminants because they're things made by man and not the animal that's eaten. So those things are called contaminants. The ones we most worry about are those that we call persistent. They're called persistent because they are concentrated in the animal's fat. And as such, they last for many, many years. Many compounds are broken down quickly, and these don't have the risk for human health that the persistent organic contaminants do.
When spilled or released into the environment, these persistent contaminants pass into the air, soil, and water. Because of the northward circulation of ocean and air currents toward the Arctic, Alaska is one of the deposition areas for contaminants that originate from outside of the Arctic. These contaminants join the deep ocean currents in the south and travel north towards the Arctic. Upon reaching Alaska, the water rises and then turns south again in a continuous cycle.
And you can see this way it's possible for rivers in Asia and Africa to contribute pollutants to the Arctic, so that these contaminants truly are worldwide. Even though they may be released in South America, they can eventually find their way to the Arctic, into the Bering Sea and North Pacific. When they reach those regions, They're taken up in the food chain by the plankton and the krill, and then by fish, and then by marine mammals. And so people who eat marine mammals and fish can ingest these compounds.
As the contaminants pass from one organism to another through the food chain, they become more and more concentrated. This process is called biomagnification. Alaska natives are also part of the food chain, as consumers of many different sea and land animals. At the very top of the food chain is the developing fetus, nurtured in the womb by the mother and the nursing baby through the mother's milk. At both of these times, a baby is at a critical stage of development. And so, there is a good reason for monitoring the health of the babies and to provide surveillance for even the most subtle health effects.
I think the most important reason to monitor infants rather than adults is that the effects of contaminants are greatest on the pregnant mother and the developing fetus. So once the baby's born in the first year of life, it's a very good time to look for certain kinds of health effects, like, for instance, infections.
We have just learned where contaminants come from and how they concentrate in the food chain through a process of biomagnification. We have also learned why understanding contaminant levels in pregnant mothers and infants is important. But how can we monitor contaminants both in food and in our bodies? Two programs which are actively monitoring contaminants are the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association Alaska Native Dietary Benefits and Risk Program and the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium's Maternal and Infant Monitoring Program, currently underway in the Aleutian Pribilof, Arctic Slope, Yukon-Kuskokwim region, as well as the Kamchatka region of the Russian Federation, including the Commander Islands. The first focuses on monitoring the contaminants in food, while the second looks at the levels in people. Both programs are currently underway in the Pribilof Islands of St. Paul in the Bering Sea. Contaminants can migrate to St. Paul in the bodies of one of their most important subsistence resources, northern Pacific fur seal. This population has been in decline for several years. There have been concerted local efforts to understand the reasons behind the decline and whether there is any connection to contaminants. Aquilina Lesnikoff, a lifelong resident of St. Paul, has been active both in fur seal conservation and contaminant research efforts.
I am Unanga from Tanagami, or from St. Paul Island, Alaska. I am employed presently as the co-director for the Ecosystem Conservation Office for the Aleut community of St. Paul Island's tribal government. Right now we are on St. Paul Island and we are on Lucannon Beach, and behind me is Lucannon Fur Seal Rookery. We're really focusing our attention at this point on the number of seals and what is causing that decline more than anything right now in our community. In the last few years, I have increased my intake of locally available foods, meaning fur seal, halibut, the birds, the reindeer. And so yes, I am concerned that that there might be contaminants or pollutants that might be affecting my health. But you know, in the last couple of years, I don't think that's the case. I am not worried at all from all that I've learned, and I think that other people have learned that have been involved in the Dietary Risks and Benefits Project here on St. Paul Island.
On St. Paul, efforts are being made to test halibut, another commonly consumed subsistence food, for contaminants and nutrients. Blair Paulus, the Traditional Foods Program Coordinator in St. Paul, coordinates the food testing program.
We've analyzed local halibut for contaminant levels, and eventually we'll be having some analyzed for nutrient levels as well. First, we did a dietary survey of about 80 people in the community, and once we did that survey, we developed a list from the survey of the top 10 local wild foods eaten in the community. And although halibut was, I think, second on the list, it was chosen because although people ate more seal than they did halibut, there are more people that eat halibut than eat seal. And so it was decided by the village advisory group that halibut was of concern to more people in the community than seal. After we had gathered 18 samples, 18 fish, and then they were sent to Edmonton, Canada, to EnviroTest laboratories where they did the contaminant analysis. Contaminants that they were looking for were pesticides. They were looking for certain heavy metals like lead and mercury. They were looking for any evidence of fuel contamination, and they were also looking for radionuclides, possible contamination from nuclear projects that have occurred over the years around the Bering Sea. The results were good, favorable for consuming halibut. The levels of all contaminants were relatively low. There was some evidence of mercury, as I recall, and I'm fairly certain that was the main one that showed up, but even so, it showed up in a very small level. And so we were happy to be able to tell people that based on the analysis that we had done on the local halibut, that it was very safe for anyone, even a pregnant mother, to eat the halibut and feel as though they were not going to be ingesting any type of contaminant that might affect their unborn child.
By looking at contaminants in the important traditional foods, we can get a good idea about the concentrations and pathways for exposure. But to know the actual exposure levels, we need to test the levels in people. This is the purpose of Dr. Berner's program, monitoring contaminant levels in the most sensitive members of the population, the pregnant mothers and newborn infants. Martina Lauterbach is a registered nurse at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. She works with Dr. Berner and coordinates the maternal and infant monitoring program. Martina traveled out to St. Paul to meet with some of the expecting mothers and talk to them about the program.
We received a resolution from Tribal Government of St. Paul to be enrolled in this program. We provided information about the program to the local clinic. So now there are some expectant mothers interested in participating. The people of St. Paul have some concerns of contaminants in their traditional diet and other diet-related diseases, like diabetes. I traveled to St. Paul to meet with the expectant mothers, answered any questions they may have had, and enroll them into the program. Before they participate in the program, they have to sign a consent form. Once the mom, like Monique, is enrolled, she takes a short dietary survey, which looks specifically at her diet. This not only benefits Monique by giving her important information about her diet, it also helps us to understand the potential exposure routes for contaminants. During the first prenatal visit, we collect a small amount of blood from the mother. However, there is no additional needle stick, and a urine sample is also collected at this visit. At birth, we take a sample of baby's blood from the umbilical cord. Since the umbilical cord and the placenta is detached from the baby, when the blood is collected, the baby never gets a needle stick or is harmed in any way. From the blood collected, we learn about the levels of contaminants that the baby was exposed to during pregnancy. Results are presented back to the mom and to the mom's doctor. We do a chart review to check on baby's health after his or her first birthday.
Blood specimens from mothers like Monique come from all over Alaska, and they're received here in a lab just like this one at the Arctic Investigations Program in Anchorage. And laboratory technicians here remove the specimens from a box like this and a bag like this, and the separate specimens are processed for different tests. The first part is tested right here in Anchorage at the CDC laboratory for infection-fighting chemicals called cytokines. One of the side effects of exposure to contaminants is a decrease in the ability to deal with infections. There are studies in northern Quebec in the Inuit population that suggest that ear infections are more common, for instance, in babies that have higher levels of contaminants as compared to Inuit infants with lower levels of contaminants. A second specimen is taken here and sent to the University of Alaska, Anchorage, to be tested for omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids are critical, essential fats for the development of a baby's brain and eyes. There are lots of omega-3 fatty acids in many traditional foods. And so typically Alaska Native women have much higher levels than women in the lower 48. We have continued to monitor human blood levels and to examine babies and mothers for health effects that could be related to the contaminants in these foods. So far, those levels are low in Alaska Natives. They're very similar to the levels seen in women in the continental United States who don't eat, for instance, sea lion or beluga whale or even much salmon. The other very important feature of these foods is that unlike many foods that are in common use in the continental United States, these are rich in micronutrients. There's a lot of scientific literature to support the health benefits of the northern marine subsistence diet, rich in fish and sea mammals.
It seems like the benefits are definitely outweighing any risks that might be there that we're not sure about yet. But I know that there are more risks that we are taking with other foods, with other things that we consume, other things that we put in our body, everything from food to what we drink to the type of medication we have, even to products that we use to clean our house. It's a bigger picture than just what we're consuming in regards to food. And we should look at this, but I don't think right now that people should be concerned about contaminants and pollutants in their traditional foods here on St. Paul Island. But I think we should watch for it.
The St. Paul program is unique, and I think it has all the components that every community in Alaska could benefit from examining. And for that reason, it's a model that we are particularly interested in pursuing in other parts of the state where there's similar community concern.
There are many efforts underway to reduce the levels of contaminants in the Arctic through education and the introduction of new environmental laws and international treaties. Many of the most harmful chemicals are being phased out. The levels of these contaminants will gradually decrease in the environment and thus in our food and bodies. However, there are new chemicals being produced each year, and programs like the Maternal and Infant Monitoring Program are keeping a close watch on the health of pregnant moms and infants. Alaskan Natives can feel good about the health of our traditional diet. For our children, it is the key to good health and to keeping our traditions alive.